Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. It's Jennifer Peltier again. Just before we get started, I just want to make sure, as the technical host for today's meeting, that we're all connected and we're all hearing the audio loud and clear. So just before we get started, could you please, if you can hear me, select the person icon at the top of your screen, click on Raise Your Hand, and then we'll get some visual confirmations that everybody's connected and hearing everything loud and clear. Fantastic. It's looking like everybody is hearing me loud and clear and connected. Fantastic. Thanks so much, everybody. So throughout today's webinar, you can feel free to communicate with our presenters through our chat pod located to the right of your screen. And then in addition, at the end of the presentation, you'll notice a brief poll that comes up, at which point you can select your answers right on the screen. And at any time, if you need technical assistance, feel free to enter it into the chat pod, and I'm there to help you. Okay, so let's get started. Vijna, are you there with us?
I am. Thanks, Jennifer. Everyone can hear me loud and clear as well, and I'll just ask our presenters today to unmute their lines as well. So again, good morning and good afternoon. My name is Vishna Zaborski-Breton, and I'm the Director of Communications with the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association. I'd like to formally welcome you all to today's webinar on cannabis legislation and the effects on Parks and Recreation in Canada. We have an extremely informative and timely webinar planned for you today, and we hope that you're going to take away some really important and interesting information. We're going to learn about how cannabis use affects sport performance and recreation activity. We're hoping to hear about some information about the myths associated with cannabis use in youth. We will hear about what the public health approach to the cannabis legislation is in Canada, and we have some takeaway tools and information for you at the end of the presentation. So as a quick introduction, for those of you who may not be familiar with us, the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association, or CPRA as we're known, is a national organization dedicated to realizing the full potential of parks and recreation as a major contributor to community health and vibrancy. CPRA is the national voice for parks and recreation in Canada. Our members are the 13 provincial and territorial parks and recreation associations and their extensive networks of service providers in over 90% of Canadian communities. CPRA hosts webinars throughout the year, providing tools, resources, and best practices for parks and recreation practitioners in Canada. We've held several different types of webinars over the years. Recently, we had one on the Framework for Recreation in Canada. We're currently hosting a Green Jobs Initiative, and we held a webinar on that earlier this spring. We've covered topics like Parks for All and the CPRA Professional Development Certification Program. If you've not had an opportunity to listen in on our webinars in the past, you can view them on the CPRA website, www.cpra.ca. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter to learn about upcoming presentations or when the slides are available for webinars such as this today. As we've mentioned previously, the webinar will be recorded and we will post it on the CPRA website for future reference. I'll be sending a notice to everyone who registered once that link is available, and we will post it on social media as well. As Jennifer mentioned, we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some questions and answers, and we'll use the chat pod function for that today. So feel free to ask questions as our presenters are kind of coming to an end of their presentation, and I'll act as a moderator. So if you do have a burning question during their presentation, and so you don't forget it, feel free to type it into the chat pod, and we will take on all of those questions and answers at the end. I'd like to thank Jennifer Peltier for joining us today and Parks and Recreation Ontario for providing us with the technical support. We always have a wonderful relationship with Parks and Rec Ontario for this capacity, and thank you very much, Jennifer, for your time. So at this time, I'd like to welcome our presenters. With us today, we have Rebecca Haynes-Saw, who is a health sociologist and assistant professor with the Department of Community Health Sciences with the University of Calgary, and Sherry Fandry, who is the Knowledge Exchange Lead with the Addictions Foundation of Manitoba. Both are extremely knowledgeable on this topic area, and so I'd like to thank them both for joining us and taking the time to prepare these presentations. And without further delay, I will turn things over to Rebecca to get us started. Okay, so we're on why are we legalizing? Perfect.
Yeah, so the first thing I'd like to do is talk about why we are legalizing cannabis, because there's been a lot of myths and misconceptions about the risks associated with legalization and what the harms will be. And I think as we're moving towards this coming up October 17th, we're seeing even more media attention and messages coming out about health harms. So I want to inform you today about the public health rationale, about the population-level health evidence that supported the policy development around legalization, and also talk to you about my work with youth and what we know about how, where, and why youth use cannabis. Okay. So the context for this policy change in Canada is that we know prohibition has been unsuccessful and has been a resounding policy failure. We have very high prevalence of cannabis use in Canada, in particular amongst those age 25. In fact, a survey from the World Health Organization in 2015 showed that amongst 15-year-olds in developed nations, we had the highest rate of cannabis use at about 28%. So we know that the illegal status has not deterred people from use. The supply that people have been accessing in the illicit market has been largely unregulated. But more importantly, what we do know is that criminalization has tangible and lasting harms for people who are arrested and charged. So there's no figure on how many arrests and possession charges we've had over time, but in 1997, when some policy analysts that I've worked with were presenting to the Senate then to talk about decriminalization and legalization, they had an estimate that over 500,000 Canadians have received possession charges. So it's a significant number, and it's particular for our young people and for our vulnerable young people. If you have a cannabis charge, of course, it impedes employment opportunities, travel opportunities, and volunteering in your community in many positions where you require a clean police check. And then finally, what we know at the population level is that based on the evidence, cannabis is associated with less harms than substances like alcohol and tobacco. However, that doesn't mean that cannabis use is safe or benign, but what we do know is that it seems to have a less morbidity and mortality attributed to it compared to alcohol especially. So starting from this public health framework and policy rationale, there's really three big things to unpack. And three of the myths that I hear most frequently as I travel and I get to have policy discussions at many levels in Alberta and across Canada are these myths about what the impact of legalization will be and the type of response required amongst us when we're working in health and social services and medicine. The first issue is that legalization will not protect public health. And I think this is a real misnomer and misrepresentation of what public health, as I understand it and where I work inside this realm to be. Really, public health is about social justice and ending the harms of prohibition and criminalization for young people. But also this assumes that the prevalence of use and the rates of harms will dramatically increase overnight. And I'm going to show you some of our data around what we know. As I've already mentioned, we already have a very high baseline. So the idea that when we move into a very regulated market where it will still be illegal for youth to purchase, that rates of prevalence will rise is somewhat of a misnomer at this point. There's also a lot of arguments leading up to legalization, in particular from some of the medical associations, that we should set the age of access as high as 21 or 25. A lot of the appetite for setting at 25, people cited the evidence from the United States. But of course, 21 was not a number based in any scientific evidence. It was actually based on the legal age for drinking in U.S. states that have legalized for medical or non-medical use. And what I argued here with my colleague, neuroscientist Matt Hill, in preparing our submission to the Alberta government, is that failing to harmonize the age of access for alcohol in our province with the age of cannabis actually creates a perception for young people that alcohol is safer, and that's something that you can freely access once you turn legal age at 18. However, cannabis you should wait until you're older, when in fact we know that drinking, and in particular binge drinking, which we have a significant rate of amongst our young people, is in fact quite harmful to young people's health and development. The final myth that I hear a lot as we move into this new context is that we need to develop education campaigns, and those campaigns need to focus on abstinence only. And there's a number of reasons why this is problematic, but chiefly because what we've done in prevention when we focused on abstinence hasn't been effective for young people. So, I mean, chiefly we already have many people saying that they've tried cannabis in their lifetimes or that they've used in the past 12 months if they're under the age of 25. And what I usually like to say about this abstinence focus is that it works for some of the kids some of the times, but just say no really does a disservice to those kids who are going to experiment, because it equips them with no information about how to stay safer through a harm reduction approach. So looking to these points and thinking about the prevalence, there's some new CSTADS data that's just come out in the late summer. But this, I think, looking over time, really captures what we know about cannabis use, and that is chiefly that it's a substance that young people use. The demographic with the most use in Canada are those aged 20 to 24. And it's quite high. It's over 50% for people reporting they've ever used, and then it drops down for people using more frequently towards daily use. So we know that while lots of people have used it and maybe used it in the past year, we have smaller numbers of people who've used it more regularly in the past 30 days and almost daily. And those are the pockets of users that I think we're really concerned about in terms of preventing those harms. The more casual use may not be as problematic, and that just sort of makes sense from a perspective on problematic substance use. Now, one thing we know over time, and unfortunately the new CSTADS data reflects an upward trend in my province, but I think it's also important, and I share this slide frequently just to give you a snapshot, because there is a great deal of provincial variation across our country in terms of rates of cannabis use and other substance use. But for the most part, in Canada over the past decade, all substance use has been on a downward trend, including alcohol, binge drinking, and diverted use of pharmaceutical drugs or accessing illicit opioids. However, data from Ontario shows that latter category has now been on the uptick among young people, reflective of the national crisis we have in opioid use and opioid poisoning deaths. And unfortunately, the CSTADS is showing that there is an upward trend in Alberta for all substance use. So we've had some success with our universal prevention, but obviously we don't have the full explanation of this picture, but we've had a severe downward economic trend in our province. We've had floods and wildfires in regions, so all of these broader structural variables can impact rates of substance use amongst youth. One thing that has not trended downwards very significantly, even as we announce the move towards legalization, has been the arrests, and then those arrests that proceed to charges. So they've just also released the 2017 numbers, and so you can see that arrests have been declining, and along with that, people charged. But if you think about the fact that 14,000 people are still being charged with possession in the year immediately preceding legalization, for me that's a significant issue. Moreover than this, it's not widely available, but media investigations into arrest rates in our major cities from Vice News in collaboration with some academics in the field have shown that in almost all of our cities, Indigenous youth, Black and racialized youth are overrepresented in our arrests and rates, and that lead to charges for cannabis. So there have been major inequities in how we've policed this, and that has long-term health and social implications for young people. Finally, to my point about cannabis attributable harms being lesser, this is a very influential analysis by David Nutt and colleagues that was published in The Lancet in 2010, and it also forms some of the rationale and provides you with some of the evidence for looking at cannabis attributable harms to users and to others as being lesser. So this was a summit and think tank of the world's leading experts in substance use-related harms, and they evaluated the evidence and ranked substances in terms of the harms to population. And you can see that the harms attributable to cannabis, both to self in terms of health harms and to others, which would be the social harms like impaired driving, domestic violence, assault, were lesser for cannabis than these other substances. Again, not stating that cannabis use is benign, but this is the population-level rationale for moving towards legalization, that we have substances that are already legal and are associated with a great deal of harm. So in public health, we use this diagram quite frequently, and it's also embedded in the messaging that we use here in Alberta to talk about this paradox of prohibition. When you have a substance that is illegal, you have very little control over the content and over the market in terms of what people are accessing. And we see this very clearly in our opioid poisoning crisis right now, where people are dying in unacceptably high numbers because they're accessing an illicit supply that's contaminated with fentanyl and other analogs that leads to overdose death. So we're looking for this sweet spot where we have legalization with strict regulation, and that is the approach that we've chosen in terms of strictly limiting the marketing, the packaging, and those other domains. If you swing to the other side of this curve, you see kind of that free market, all-out corporate profit model. And this varies considerably across provinces in terms of how we've set up how and where cannabis will be accessible. But certainly when people talk about the impact of legalization in Colorado, the important thing to remember is that in these U.S. states, the free market is relatively unchecked compared to what we're proposing. They're allowed to have signage, promotion, colorful packaging, things that could potentially appeal to children, many aspects of their framework that will not be happening here in Canada. So to these points, my colleagues at the Center for Addiction of Mental Health who spearheaded this policy change in their 2014 document, Cannabis Policy Framework, it sort of formed the backbone of the Federal Task Force report. They asked this critical question: is keeping something illegal and the best way to prevent the potential social harms and health harms for youth? And they make this really great analogy to the harms associated with hockey. Because we know now from the epidemiological evidence in youth, and very relevant to your work in community recreation and sport and parks, that hockey is associated with a fair degree of the potential for harm and head trauma and long-term impacts of concussion for young people. But we don't ban young people under 25 from playing hockey. We try to strictly regulate sport and change the culture of the game and to shift our values. Because hockey is so embedded in Canadian culture, it's not something we would ever think of banning or making illegal for young people to keep them safer. And they make the similar argument for cannabis. So how should we talk to kids? Given this context of legalization, this is the question I get asked most frequently by media, by parents, and by policymakers: what approaches are likely to work? So given what we know, this is a substance that most people, young people, use infrequently and without significant negative health or social outcomes. And as I've shown, most use is concentrated among those young people under age 25 and then tends to taper off dramatically. The literature is still developing, but what we do know for sure are two things: that initiating early onset under the age of 16 and using frequently and intensely is associated with greater harm, longer cannabis use trajectories associated with dependence, and problematic use. So it's important to impart to youth that not all use is problematic. if this is the message, our research with youth in BC has shown, if this is the message, all use is bad, abstinence only, prevention, youth quickly tune this out. So we developed a school-based resource, and I think it's really relevant to the work that you do because it is based on physical activity and participation in outdoor sport. We conducted the largest long-term study of frequent cannabis users, so this is young people using daily or almost daily, in 3 BC communities over a period of 10 years. And this was young people aged 13 to 18 who were attached to high schools. And what youth told us is that they really, they really tuned out these ideas around scare tactics, around just say no only. They really dismissed the idea of a stoner stereotype of someone, who was a loser or who wasn't engaged with their community or with their school. And young men in particular, based on BC's culture of outdoor activity in the cities and also in some of the more rural areas where we did interviews, used cannabis while participating in outdoor sports such as mountain biking, backcountry skiing, and other ways of getting out into nature and connecting with their friends. So we use this motif of cycling to reach young men. And in this film and resource, we didn't talk about health effects, we didn't talk about criminal effects, we talked about this idea of a shared culture, of being a role model, how cannabis affects your relationships and your romantic relationships. And we ultimately show a young man making decisions to stop using cannabis and how that affects his relationships with the people he cares about, because that's what young people told us resonated with them rather than being lectured by adults about health harms. So here is some baseline information that I share when I present in the high school context, developed from cycles, but also from the work of the lower risk cannabis use guidelines have been developed by CRISM, the Canadian Research Initiative in Substance Misuse that I am a part of for the Prairie Node, and also thinking about not just cannabis, but globally, when should someone worry about their use of substances, and when is it too much, and when is it moving into that domain of problematic use and risk? Because I think many times in our rush to educate young people about the harms of drug use, we don't provide them with these metrics. It's almost an all or nothing or an abstinence or harm approach. So some of these questions are useful for talking to high school age students about the potential for risk. And the mantra of not using too much, not using too often, and only in safe context, for example, when you know the people and you know the surroundings, or when you're not going to be driving, those are very concrete things we can tell people about reducing risks. I'd also like to point you to a newer tool, and I'm so thrilled to see that yesterday when they had the Cannabis Education Summit partnership meeting sponsored by Health Canada in Ottawa, that this was one of the tools highlighted, and they had a youth panel focused on really hearing youth perspectives on why they use cannabis and the ways that they believe we can talk to youth about reducing harms. Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy is a youth-driven organization, and they've developed this toolkit, Sensible Cannabis Education, and they also advance these harm reduction messages for youth who are already using cannabis or who are going to be curious about experimenting. And we can unpack some of these later. So in conclusion, I think as we move into this new context, we really have to think critically about doing things in a new way. Preaching to young people about harms and having a one-way conversation where we lecture them and provide a bunch of drug facts has really not been effective in the classroom. Most of this prevention has been delivered through the DARE program by police officers, and it hasn't shown outcomes for changing behavior. So we provide information, but it doesn't lead to behavior change. The other thing that I think has emerged quite sharply to me when I've participated in lots of forums is that people believe that if we have these conversations with young people, that leads them to go out and experiment with drugs, if we have open and honest dialogue. I think just like we've taken the approach for sexual health and sexual activity, I think we have to get to the place where we understand that having these open conversations about risks and harms and also why people engage in these activities in an open and honest way does not cause the behavior, but it may equip young people with some knowledge that they can use. And to this regard, I think listening to youth and their experiences and perspectives and going on just health expertise and this kind of closed circle of adult-only perspective is very much needed. And that we have to think really critically and carefully about whether or not what we're doing is going to empower youth or is it just designed to protect them. And I think that youth are very active and engaged in their communities, and there's ways to reach out to them so that we're not only telling them about what they're doing as potentially harmful, but how to engage them in ways to stay safer. And then finally, relevant to your work, I think we have to consider that the best drug prevention is really not specific about drugs at all, but really the important work that you're doing of building community, of providing opportunities for recreation, for social engagement, for community engagement. We know all of these things build resilience among youth and are protective factors because we have the evidence that drug prevention and drug fact education doesn't work. These upstream focus interventions are, I think, where we need to go. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. That was terrific. While I'm just waiting for Sherry to start her presentation, I wondered if there were some websites that you could share with our participants on the couple different the film and the tools that you mentioned, as well if there are websites that folks can visit. That would be terrific. So perhaps I will ask you to type that into the chat pod, and then while Sherry gets going, and then we can perhaps have some time at the end to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, the Cycles resource is available at CSIR at the University of Victoria, and it's free download and free screening of that movie. And the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy have their own website where you can download the toolkit.
Okay. That's great. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
All right. We'll turn things over to Sherry.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak, and thank you, Rebecca, for such great, strong messaging about the true risks and reality of cannabis use in youth from a public health perspective. I think, as you say, the best drug prevention is very often not related to the drug at all. That said, I am going to talk a little bit more about some of the risks related to cannabis, where that window of risk is widest for young people. And to understand that, we really need to have a sense of, I think, an accurate sense of how many people do use cannabis. Across Canada, recent data indicates that use ranges from 10% to 20% amongst Canadians 15 years and older, the national average being around 14%. So that is probably contrary to some people's perception that everyone or almost everybody uses cannabis. This clearly isn't true. A large part of the population doesn't use and has no plans to use once it becomes legalized in several weeks. When you look at patterns of cannabis use that are more risky than others, we know that the riskier patterns of use are associated with poorer health outcomes, substance use disorders, mental health and behavior problems, as well as some lower levels of educational and employment outcomes. So a group of researchers, Canadian researchers, have conducted a very interesting study of almost 700 young Canadians' marijuana use over more than a decade. So this is where this information on the patterns of cannabis use has come from. And they have found that you can broadly designate young cannabis users into 5 different categories. Of those 5 categories, there's really only 2 of them that represent just over 30% of the population of young people that they studied, the increasers and chronic users who really are more vulnerable to the poorer health outcomes that we know that come from risky cannabis use. So that really dovetails with what Rebecca was saying, that for the most part, cannabis use doesn't become seriously problematic for young people. It's a fairly small population of those who are going to have the worst potential outcomes. Certainly in your roles around recreation and young people, there is some concern around how do we identify people who are using, what does intoxication look like, and when you compare that to our well-known approach to alcohol misuse and intoxication, we have fairly good gut reactions to when intoxication has occurred with alcohol and what that looks like. We really don't have the same kind of sense with cannabis. It's a lot harder to be certain that you're detecting intoxication for people who are using cannabis. Part of the reason for that is that cannabis affects different people in different ways, so the signs and symptoms of use could vary from one person to another. The most common physical and mental symptoms include things like bloodshot eyes, reduced reaction time. You might also notice that characteristic smell if a person is smoking cannabis. There may be some changes in behavior in person's interests. Overall, the effects that are occurring when somebody is intoxicated are related to those that you see in the screen. So perceptions become distorted, problem-solving abilities, that higher-level thinking becomes affected. There may be learning and memory issues while the person is intoxicated. The person might be experiencing dry mouth and red eyes. There could be some anxiety and paranoia, and certainly we know that this is related more to products that contain higher levels of THC, the active ingredient. There are coordination problems and potential loss of control. And a number of these effects of intoxication do have an impact on young people's ability to perform in different sports and athletic activities. I'll come back to that in just a few slides. I did want to spend just a very brief time looking at how does cannabis work, hoping not to overwhelm people in the pharmacology. We do know that there is a system inside of our body, our brain and our body, that responds to cannabinoid type substances or things that are related to cannabis. We also know that we have a number of these chemicals within our body that are designed for a number of very important physiological processes, including appetite control, pain and pleasure sensations, immune system functioning, our mood, our memory, and a number of others. So when a person takes in a cannabis product that provides a cannabinoid that can come into our system, it can have some really broad effects across both our brain but also other physiological functions as well. I need to emphasize that not all of those effects are negative, and certainly some of those effects with certain cannabinoid substances have been found to have some medical benefits. When you're looking at cannabinoids, there are two main substances that are produced within our brain and our body that affect that system, the cannabinoid system. Anandamide and 2-HE are the two that are internal. And then we have plant-derived cannabinoids, and that includes THC, which is the active ingredient, and cannabidiol, which is an ingredient that doesn't produce intoxication, but it does seem to be related to a number of the medical effects and medical benefits that have been touted for cannabis. It's hard to understand how chemicals that look so very different when you compare the left-hand chemicals with the right-hand chemicals, the endogenous ones with the plant-based ones, how on earth can the plant-based ones actually work in our body? And just show you a crystal X-ray image of the chemicals as they actually fold up and are in three-dimensional space, you can see that the THC ingredient ends up having a very, very similar kind of three-dimensional shape as our internal chemicals do. So that's how it comes in and co-opts this system that is designed to have a number of physiological functions in our body. The effects of cannabis in the short term, we would be looking at a number of different processes, physical and mental processes that could be affected. Certainly, again, because it's affecting a number of different parts of the brain that are involved with thinking and problem solving. The way that the brain processes information can be affected. Again, the red eyes are characteristic. Heavy use, and by this I mean heavy daily use of cannabis, is certainly related to the development of addiction and dependence. The munchies derive from a brain circuit that controls appetite, so that's something else that can correspond to the short-term effects of cannabis. It is also going to likely affect the system in the brain that affects balance. And that's certainly something that we have to be concerned about when athletes or people involved with sports are using and maybe using under the influence of cannabis. That important coordination function may not be what we expect it to be. And certainly one of the effects that we're looking for, or that people like about cannabis, is the fact that it makes you feel euphoric. It gives you this bubble of happiness. People generally describe that as feeling chilled out. Seems to relieve anxiety in some people, and certainly has that positive reinforcing good feeling in the brain. One factor related to short-term cannabis use that I think has really not been focused on enough is that while you're under the influence of cannabis, your heart rate actually increases, and it can increase by up to 50 beats a minute. This can last for minutes to even several hours after the use, and certainly while the heart rate is already elevated, engaging in exercise that has a high cardiovascular component could potentially put athletes at risk. So certainly using cannabis prior to a very demanding, physically demanding activity is not advised. Some of the longer-term negative health effects, again, these are related more to heavier daily use of cannabis, but certainly there is a potential for a chronic cough to develop in the lungs. As I mentioned, dependency tolerance, needing more to have the same effect. Respiratory infections related to the things that are going on in the lungs, especially if the product is smoked. There could be some transient memory loss. For adults who stop using, that memory function tends to bounce back. We're not quite sure how it might be affected by really heavy cannabis use in young people. There is some potential for some negative emotional and psychological things to be happening as well. Psychosis is a possibility. It has been linked to heavy daily use of cannabis, and certainly in somebody who has a family history of schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, that's a concern. Some people have anxiety, panic attacks, hallucinations that may be unpleasant, and again, this is related more to heavier use and certainly products that have a higher THC concentration as well. And I want to reinforce something that certainly Rebecca had mentioned and hinted at in her presentation, that teen brain is still under construction. The higher executive functioning in the brain doesn't fully develop until well into the 20s, and that was related to some of the recommendations around the legal age and that discussion that has happened. So certainly the teen years, adolescence, is a very important developmental stage for the brain. A number of things are happening at that point, and all of them are designed to make the brain function more effectively and more efficiently. So in the teenage brain, the part of the brain that might be related to impulse control and maybe just giving the person a hint that this might not be a good idea at this moment, the ability to delay gratification, is overpowered by the part of the brain that is telling the young person that, oh, but I want to do this right now. There's an imbalance in that impulse control and the desire. So that makes it a little bit more likely that young people who get involved with drugs earlier could run into problems with them. Specifically, effects in the brain that might be related to exercise and sports. There are a number of different brain regions that are affected by cannabis use. Just go through some of the more relevance one by one. In terms of the hypothalamus, this is part of the brain that controls appetite. THC in cannabis produces increased appetite that may lead to weight gain, which could have an impact Certainly I don't want to talk about body dysmorphia, but weight gain for certain sports is an important element of what category you might be classified in. The part of the brain that controls fine movements is affected by THC and cannabis, so that means that reaction time might be slowed. Again, this could have an impact on certain activities in sports. Again, the part of the brain, the more highly developed part of the brain that is related to our sensory perceptions and thinking is affected by cannabis. So that may lead to a reduced ability to respond quickly in an activity or to use proper judgment. And that could lead to some difficulties for people involved with sports. The part of the brain that is largely responsible for memory and learning is impaired while using cannabis, so this could lead to a reduced ability to remember or learn new tactics related to sport or activities. The back part of the brain, the cerebellum, that is involved with motor control and memory functions related to muscular activity, is reduced. So that leads to impaired coordination, and certainly that could be dangerous in certain aspects of activities and sport. Another part of the brain that is responsible for detecting threat and interpreting emotions, amongst other things, the amygdala, can lead to increased anxiety and paranoia with cannabis use, certainly with a higher THC concentration products. So that could lead to difficulty in coping with stress of competition, and that is certainly for the higher performance athletes something that could be an important consideration. And another part of the brain that is connected with the reward system and related to pleasure from activities, THC does produce euphoria and relaxation. If somebody is using cannabis products because they're feeling stressed, just to cope with having a rough day, for example, that could mean that the brain is learning to make a connection between feeling bad and using cannabis to feel better. The more we use cannabis to feel better, the stronger that connection becomes. So that produces a serious risk of not developing relaxation and coping skills other than cannabis. And that is certainly not something that would be desirable for young people. On top of all of that, we do know that adolescence is an important time for some really key developmental things happening in the brain. And as I said, these are things that are related to improved processing speed and efficiency. And we know that cannabis use early, before the age of 16, leads to some disturbances in that process, which may or may not be able to catch up, depending on when the person started using and how much they've used. So there is a potential for reduced processing speed and efficiency of mental processing for somebody who has started early and perhaps been a heavier user. Some of the signs of a problem from cannabis use, I know that Rebecca has already outlined some of the things that you want to look for. Some others that you may want to consider include things like somebody who's using daily or almost daily. That would indicate that there might be a reliance on cannabis. Somebody who needs cannabis simply to feel normal, and without it you feel irritable and anxious if you haven't recently used. Another sign could be needing more. That's related to developing a tolerance for the drugs. You need more to get the effect that you desire. If people are commenting on how much you use, the people who are around you, your friends, your colleagues, teammates, are commenting about how much you're using, that could be a signal that they're trying to tell you that maybe your use is getting a little bit problematic. If your school performance or performance in other activities is decreasing, your ability to focus, your ability to get to commitments on time, to complete tasks on time, if that's suffering, that could be an indication that there's a problem developing. If you generally are losing interest in achieving goals and things that you usually enjoy, so in the context of sport and activities, recreation, that could be starting to not participate in some of those activities that used to be very important. That can be a signal as well. If Young people are not maintaining their household responsibilities, other activities. That tends to create conflict at home, and that could be a sign of a problem. If there are problems developing in family relationships with siblings, with mom, dad, other close family members, that could be a signal as well. If a young person is generally carrying weed all the time, if they have a cannabis supply on them all the time, if they're spending a lot of money buying it, if they're thinking a lot about it, that's a signal that it's starting to become a focus in their lives. And if you smoke weed and drive, that's definitely a signal of problematic use. We know that the driving impairment, even with experienced drivers, is impaired with cannabis, and certainly with younger drivers, it's not something that should be encouraged. So the same study that I referred to at the beginning of my part of the presentation that looked at almost 700 young people over a period of 10 years, looked at the different kind of classifications of how much people used. They also looked at what are some of the outcomes from heavy cannabis use, from that part of the population of young people who really were engaging in risky use of cannabis. And what they found that compared to those people, young people who didn't use cannabis at all, the chronic users and the people who were increasing their use of cannabis were much more likely to experience a number of negative elements in their life trajectory. They're more likely to develop depression, anxiety, and behavioral problems over that 10-year time frame. At the end of the study period, they tended to have higher debt levels, they had less income, and they experienced greater difficulty in paying for bills. They also found that those heavier users of cannabis also seem to have heavier use of alcohol and other illicit drugs. I'm not saying in any way that there's a gateway effect, because that really doesn't have any evidence to back up a gateway for cannabis use. However, that association between the heavy cannabis use and other substance use certainly does seem to be connected. And also, young people who were the heavier users of cannabis had poor school performance and ended up with less prestigious jobs that didn't pay as well and had less satisfaction within them. And again, just to reiterate that researchers affiliated with the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Ontario, and also affiliated with CRISM, Canadian Research Initiative on Substance Misuse, of which I'm also a member of the Prairie Node, developed lower risk cannabis guidelines. And Rebecca again referred to those from a harm reduction perspective, and certainly that's how they're intended to be used. There are 10 recommendations related to reducing health risks, and it indicates that these guidelines are lower risk. The only way to have no risk from any substance is to not use it all. This isn't meant to be a guideline that's promoting abstinence. However, realistically, we know that there are some risks related to cannabis use, and if you want to eliminate all risk, this is the only way to do it. Delaying your use until later in life is also a way to reduce some of the risks of cannabis. Finding a product that has a more balanced THC to CBD level, so not using products that have a very high THC level, not using the synthetic cannabinoids at all, finding safer methods of use rather than smoking the dried cannabis, not practicing exaggerated smoking techniques, things like deep breathing and holding your breath. It's not necessary. The THC is going to get in the bloodstream regardless. Reduce how often you're using cannabis. Again, we're trying to avoid daily or near daily use. Don't use and drive. We really don't have any good information on safe levels of cannabis use in driving. So the best option is, if you are going to drive, as Rebecca mentioned, find alternate methods of travel so you're not driving, or find somebody who's not using to drive. We need to consider that, again, we don't have great evidence on the effect of cannabis in pregnancy, but we do know that there are some connections between cannabis use in pregnancy and some adverse outcomes in the child. Certainly nothing nearly as bad as the effect of alcohol in pregnancy, but again, for the best outcome for the fetus, it's better to not use cannabis during pregnancy or to cut down as much as you are able to. And also, if there's certain mental health issues, certain mental health issues mean that it would probably be better not to use cannabis. And avoid combining any of the previous risks. Combining any of them would make it even a more risky proposition. So I do have a number of information resources. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. We need to have some time for questions. There is a talking pot with youth. I've included the link at the bottom. If you were to Google that, you would be able to come up with this very new pamphlet. The Canadian Public Health Association has a centralized resource that is very helpful. And there is a workbook developed that has been really gaining a lot of traction in Manitoba. It was developed here, but it's available across Canada. And it takes a person through, what does their use look like? Is it risky use? And what might they think about doing to reduce the risks of their cannabis use? This is something that is available for order at the website that's indicated. They also have healthy choices for alcohol as well, which might be something that interests you, as alcohol use is even more prevalent than cannabis use in young people. And that is the end of my presentation. I'll turn it back to Vishna.
Thank you so much, Sherry. That was terrific, and thank you to both of you. So at this point in time, I'd love to open up dialogue with our participants. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat pod. We do have a few more minutes left before we all have to sign off, and certainly there was a lot of information that was presented. If there is anything that's specific to your role day-to-day that you would like to ask about, please feel free. I would like to actually just pose a question to some of the participants, I'm sure, as the legislation is now coming into effect. There's probably quite a lot of work being done in your specific regions. If there is resources that you're developing or that you would like to share with others across the country, realizing obviously that there's going to be some specifics to your municipalities and your workplaces, but if there are regulations that you're working on and would like to share, we would welcome that information as well. So we're just looking for any questions at this point. Feel free to type into the chat pod. And Jennifer, perhaps while we're waiting for some questions to be typed in, we did have an evaluation, just a few quick questions for you while we wait for Alex and Eric. They're typing away. So we do appreciate everyone's participation in these CPRA webinars, and we are always looking for new ideas for future webinars. If there's content that you're specifically looking for information on in your region, and CPRA can play that role, we're happy to put together a webinar on a specific topic. So we do have a question from Eric. He's asking, is there any advice for an outdoor club close to schools with lots of kids hanging out and smoking on their premises? Sherry and Rebecca, any ideas?
I'll be a bit cheeky here. This is Sherry from Winnipeg. Maybe consider advocating for legislation like we did at a municipal level in Winnipeg, where use of any smoking product is prohibited within, I believe, 50 meters or 100 meters of any playing fields or area where youth congregate, so playgrounds and sports fields. It's been something that has made a difference in Winnipeg on a municipal level. I think that engaging with the administration from the schools, clearly the students are not allowed to smoke on school property, but having that conversation with the administration to see if there might be options other than, you know, proximity to the outdoor club that would prevent that secondhand smoke from interfering with people who are engaging in activity might be an idea as well.
And Eric is just saying that it is already a provincial law not to smoke in proximity, but of course kids are ignoring those signs.
Yeah.
Alex has a question. Oh, sorry. Did you have anything else further on that, Sherry, that you wanted to mention?
I think just communication. Communicate with the kids, you know, in a respectful way. Just indicate what the issue is. Ask them if they could find another location. We usually find that more communication with young people is better than less, and they may actually, you know, not realize what they're doing and that it's a problem, and may be able to find other solutions.
Absolutely. I think, like you were saying earlier about kind of working as a collective. So in Winnipeg, you were saying that the municipality took on, it was probably a collective that came together to help change that kind of bylaw in Winnipeg, I'm assuming?
Yes, it was.
Mm-hmm. So I think that would be, to Alex's question as well, where he's asking what rules are being put in place for, you know, smoking in public places, and if it's going to be similar to smoking cigarettes. And I believe that that is the case likely in, I can't speak about all municipalities, but I think that, you know, the way that the municipality is treating smoking tobacco, they could choose to treat cannabis in that same way, but they may decide to do it differently as well. Rebecca, do you have any insights from your region about that from a municipal standpoint?
Yeah, it's first and foremost a provincial framework, and then municipalities have discretion around those, choosing whether or not to harmonize with tobacco laws or to set forth something different. It differs it's quite different regionally, so I think it impedes upon everyone to know what is happening in different cities in their jurisdiction. In Calgary, they've banned any form of consumption, not just smoking, but vaping or edibles, with the exception of a medical authorization. So people who have medically authorizations are legally allowed to consume anywhere. Of course, if it's a smoke product, it's not prohibited by law in terms of that smoke. So I think it's complicated. Municipalities have indicated that some are starting stricter, some are starting recognizing that it's impossible to enforce and people will need somewhere to consume. And then they're going to evaluate as they go forward and see what needs to be changed.
In Manitoba, we took a slightly different approach, where it is one of the areas that the province opted to enforce or enact legislation. So in Manitoba, people are prohibited from smoking or vaping cannabis products anywhere in public. So that's more restrictive, and it's at a higher level at the provincial level compared to smoking cigarettes. So fundamentally, it comes down to the fact that you are allowed to smoke cannabis in your home, in your yard, and it was suggested in a news article today that people might be allowed to smoke in their car, but not in the driver's seat. It would be in the back seat, and if you show any indication of taking control of the car, like going in the front seat, having the keys on you, that you could be charged.
That's really fascinating. I find that that's really fascinating that they may allow that in cars with, yeah, I find that interesting. Sarah, go ahead.
That was a workaround for people who rent, who don't have homes.
Yes.
And I agree with you. It's an interesting proposal, and it is fraught with potential difficulties.
Absolutely. I guess I just, from the secondhand smoke part, how would that affect a driver? Again,
Oh, if the car's in motion, you can't. It would have to be parked.
Oh, I see. Okay, I misunderstood
Yeah.
that. Okay, that's good. Sarah Ann had kind of just asked about, but like it's enforcing the how, and I mean not that we all have the answers to it, but the bylaw officers are going to be in charge of kind of enforcing these public no smoking kind of regulations, I guess, that could potentially be very challenging and taxing, I would say, on a municipal, bylaw officer. Do you have any sense of how things might, like, are they going to be hiring more staff to take that on? Like, how is that going to all roll out?
That's a very interesting question. I think this is an interesting experiment. Many of the questions are only going to be answered in hindsight because Manitoba as a province has taken such a restrictive view of use of cannabis products in public. They have increased the role of municipally in Winnipeg, the police cadets now have an enhanced role around enforcement. We have, because we have major river system, there are river bylaw enforcement, river police. They'll be able to enforce the legislation around use and transportation. So I think it is going to definitely put a higher level of, it will have a higher level impact on those people who are working in the area of bylaw enforcement and quite possibly, really stress their resources.
Right. Being cognizant of time, it is 1:34. I just wanted, Mark had just kind of mentioned a question about whether school curricula, is prepared to kind of talk about that upcoming legislation, and it's a really good question. I personally don't know the answer to that. Sherry, I don't know if you know anything in Manitoba that some of the schools are taking on.
Yeah, we developed a package of resources for schools, broadly based around harm reduction and, effective prevention, which again often doesn't involve talking about the drug at all. So we've circulated that to every school in Manitoba. It's pretty much dependent on the school and the school division, how they use the material. Certainly it's being encouraged to be part of our health curricula in senior years. I would argue that that's probably too late. That we really need to be targeting discussions about substance use and about just general coping behaviors much earlier in the school system, in elementary school, the early years. So to my knowledge, there isn't anything of that nature that's been planned anywhere across Canada that I'm aware.
Yeah, I suspect that there will be more information pending as the legislation does take effect, and the school boards and the provinces and all of our different areas of jurisdiction try to kind of get into a place where they have that information prepared and circulated. And from CPRA standpoint, we'll certainly share any information that would be relevant from a Parks and Recreation standpoint, so feel free to contact us and let us know. Let your PT, your Provincial and Territorial Parks and Recreation Association know about some of those resources, and we would be happy to play a role in sharing that in the future. So again, I am cognizant of time. I do realize that we could probably be here for quite a lot longer, but I think what I will do is take this opportunity to thank Rebecca and Sherry for joining us today and really providing us with such a extensive presentation on this topic. I do believe that there will be a lot more information to come in the weeks and months, as we kind of go into this new and brave world in Canada. So I do appreciate all the participants joining us today. We will make this recording available. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sharing the recording link with everyone who registered, as well as sharing that on social media. You can download the presentation. As Jennifer mentioned, it is located at the top of the screen above the chat pod. If you want to take a moment and do that before signing off, please feel free to do that. And once again, I'd like to thank Jennifer Peltier and Parks and Recreation Ontario for helping us out with the technical side of the webinar today. So with that, we're going to sign off, and if you should have any other questions about this webinar or any other upcoming webinars, please feel free to reach out to us at info@cpra.ca or visit our website at www.cpra.ca. So thanks again, Sherry. We appreciate your time. And Rebecca unfortunately had to sign off already, but we will thank her as well.